The first thing I learned about the Helter Skelter murders was a lie. I was 18 years old and a senior in high school. We were covering the 60s in American history when the teacher muttered the name Charles Manson. I didn't know who Manson was, but I heard several classmates ominously hitch in their breath at the sound of his name. My teacher explained to those of us unaware of the story that Manson was a cult leader who commanded his followers to kill people in 1969. Then she told us one of the victims was a movie star. Her name was Sharon Tate, and she was pregnant when they stabbed her. One of the killers actually cut Sharon's baby out of her womb. After the murmurs of oohs and ahs subsided, the class moved on to the subjects of Woodstock, the moon landing, and the My Lai massacre. But all I could picture the rest of the hour was a baby sliced out of a woman's belly. Months later, a friend loaned me his paperback copy of Helter Skelter, the true crime tale of Charles Manson, his cult of thrill-kill followers, and their infamous murder trials. Written by Vincent Bugliosi, the man who prosecuted the Manson family for their crimes, Helter Skelter thoroughly explained the bizarre motive that was used to convict the killers, and it revealed to the public a criminal mastermind the likes of which we had never seen before. Charles Manson, an ex-convict, pimp, forger, and auto thief, somehow brainwashed a bunch of hippie kids in California into murdering for him. Manson, a frustrated musician who wanted fame in the worst way, lived at a Western film set north of the Hollywood Hills. He and his family were dropping acid and having orgies together like a bunch of dirty savages when they weren't murdering people. According to the motive presented at trial, Manson believed that an apocalyptic race war between black and white people was imminent. He called his end times vision Helter Skelter, inspired by a song on the Beatles' White Album of 1968. While the four Beatles were in no way involved in the crimes, the Manson family allegedly believed the album contained hidden messages to them, confirming their belief that a violent racial conflict was coming. Manson told his family that black people would win this impending race war, and most white people would be slaughtered. He and his followers would escape certain death by retreating to Death Valley, where they would live in a magical crystal cavern beneath the desert. Manson also prophesied that after a few years, the black victors would realize they lacked leadership skills. Manson and his family, who would number 144,000, a figure taken from Revelations in the Bible, would then emerge from under the desert and be asked to take over rule of the planet. Prosecutor Bugliosi claimed that when Manson's apocalyptic vision failed to come to fruition, Charlie ordered his followers to start Helter Skelter themselves. He wanted them to kill white people, but make it look like black people did it. This would incite a race war in retaliation, with Manson set up to reap the rewards. This sounds like the craziest thing anyone ever heard. But in the late 1960s, crazy had gone mainstream. We had spiraled into a combative and trippy version of reality after President John F. Kennedy's assassination, the build-up to war in Vietnam, the permeation of the drug culture, the civil rights movement, and the violent riots that were plaguing American cities. Conservative couples started swinging. Patriots went AWOL and escaped to Canada. Suburban housewives were dropping LSD at Tupperware parties. Everyone was looking for an answer. More mystical and far out the solutions offered, more logical they sometimes seemed in those heady times. Americans were having a collective nervous breakdown. At that moment, we were willing to listen to the hippies, the yippies, the freaks, and the manic street preachers to make sense of our lives. The family dynamic had broken down as well. with record numbers of divorces by the mid-60s, and many Americans were opting for unconventional definitions of family and home. The commune, inspired by Israeli kibbutzes where people farmed together and shared equal responsibility, began to crop up across our own landscape. Nowhere was the notion of reinventing life and love more prevalent than in California. There, the dropouts and dopeheads, wise men and weirdos, were infiltrating everyday society. By the late 60s, a crop of so-called spiritual gurus had sprung up, particularly on the West Coast, each offering wisdom and enlightenment. Most were peaceable, if a bit disheveled. They preached of mind expansion, fueled by psychedelic drugs. Those who flocked to these gurus were chiefly young, almost exclusively white, but of all economic classes. They were harmless, these hippies and their sages, their gurus, their maharishi. They just wanted to spread peace and love, man. The Manson family ultimately annihilated the perception of hippies as peaceable. No shoes, no shirt, no service, sprung out of the hippie backlash that rippled across America after the murders. The family never regarded themselves as hippies, yet the entire free love generation were lumped in with these so-called slippies, these bloodthirsty kids on acid, slicing through screen windows, slithering into the homes of the rich and privileged to slaughter them. Now, in the aftermath of the riots in Watts, Newark, and Detroit during that era, many Americans feared a violent conflict between blacks and whites. We had painfully morphed from a slave-holding nation to a semblance of desegregation in one century. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 finally gave black families a sense of place and justice in American society. No longer strung up in trees for imagined crimes, no longer hunted by hounds and bounty men in the swamps of the South, no longer firebombed by the KKK. But the relative calm of federal laws of protection raised deeper questions in black communities about policing, about housing, and about true equality, which did not yet exist. It still doesn't exist today. But empowered by the Civil Rights Act, black Americans began to ask why. And when the answers were not acceptable, they took to the streets. Angry race riots and insurrection swept through the nation during that decade. The most notorious, Detroit, July 1967, might properly be called a rebellion. During these days of rage, hundreds of people died, tens of thousands were arrested, and hundreds of businesses were looted, ransacked, and firebombed, including black-owned stores. In the wake of these riots, black politicians were elected as mayors, representatives, and eventually governors in sweeping electoral reforms. People were listening as the last embers of arson from the riots were quenched. Even the most racist of folk recognized that the tide had turned, and white America could no longer assume that black people would remain in a submissive position. Charles Manson spent his teens, 20s, and early 30s incarcerated in a deeply racially divided correction system. He witnessed many prison race riots during those years. Joe Burns, professor of communication at Southeastern Louisiana University, in the 2016 Time Warner documentary Charles Manson, Fame and Scandal, explained, he saw the populations in prison become increasingly black, and they would take over a prison. So that was his view of the world, black taking over. In the summer of 1969, Manson eloquently told several people that it was Blackie's turn. Charlie stoked the natural fears of his cult members that racial tensions were building in our cities. He supplemented his jibber-jabber with a steady stream of drugs, group sex, and behavioral modification until most of these young people were stripped of their identities and their conscience. And then, in the summer of 1969, he sent several of them to kill. He told them that with their actions, Los Angeles would burn to the ground and other cities would follow. With those murders, Helter Skelter would surely begin. But when the retaliation didn't happen, the family slunk into the desert to regroup. 3 months after the crimes, law enforcement remained mystified about who committed these brutal murders. Then finally, members of the family began talking, starting a chain reaction that led to the arrest of Manson and the others. The criminal justice system rushed to indict and then convict those who participated in these gruesome murders. The prosecution was based upon the motive of Helter Skelter, the race war that inspired Manson and his followers to kill. The prosecution was successful, and everyone was found guilty and sentenced accordingly. Except that Helter Skelter wasn't the motive for the crimes. Victims of the Manson family included actress Sharon Tate, her unborn baby, a successful hairdresser, a coffee heiress, a Polish playboy, married business owners, a reserved music teacher, a stuntman, and a high school graduate. Each victim was savagely murdered, each terrorized, but it is the specter of the nearly 9 months pregnant Sharon Tate that haunts many of us. The brutal slaughter of a pregnant woman is literally the stuff of nightmares. How could those kids commit such a depraved act? The murders began in late July 1969 at the hillside home of Gary Hinman. Hinman, a music teacher, befriended the Manson family the year before. Gentle and quiet, Gary was a devout Buddhist and a chemist by trade. When the family needed help, Gary had proved a loyal and generous friend. The family repaid that friendship by beating and stabbing him after he jeopardized their relationship with an influential biker gang. The killers left a cryptic paw print in Gary's blood at the scene, along with the words, "Political Piggy." 2 weeks later, 4 Manson followers drove to the Bel Air home of actress Sharon Tate. Tate's husband, film director Roman Polanski, was in Europe when his wife, hairstylist Jay Sebring, heiress Abigail Folger, her boyfriend Wojtek Frykowski, and 18-year-old guest Stephen Parent were beaten, shot, and stabbed to death. Their bodies were found the following morning in a scene of utter carnage by a housekeeper. A message in Sharon's blood was left at this scene. It read, "Pig." The next night, the killers drove to the suburban home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. Both were stabbed to death. The killers left behind bloody messages of "Death to pigs," "Rise," and "Helter Skelter," then ate watermelon and drank chocolate milk in the victim's kitchen after the slaughter. 2 weeks later, Spawn ranch hand Donald Shea was stabbed to death by several men at Manson's orders. His body was thrown in a shallow grave, dug up a day later, and reburied in another location. The family believed Shea was to blame for a recent police raid at the ranch. Charlie didn't like snitches. Despite the similarities between the crime scenes, including the type of knives used, the number and savagery of stab wounds, the messages written in the victim's blood, and commonality of those messages, law enforcement initially failed to connect the crimes to one another. It was only because of 2 young women that these murders were solved. One, the girlfriend of the man implicated in Hinman's death, told police about the brutality and terror of living with the Manson family. She also implicated the second woman, a participant in Hinman's murder, to the killings in Bel Air. That woman, Susan Atkins, was in a jail cell where she began bragging about her crimes to other inmates. 2 of them reported Susan's horrific stories to law enforcement. A month later, Atkins testified before the grand jury and was later indicted. The following summer, she went to trial, along with 3 other defendants. One of those defendants was the mastermind, Charles Manson. Before O.J. Simpson was accused of double homicide, before there was a Casey Anthony, before the Menendez brothers stood trial, the prosecution of the Manson family was known as the trial of the century. Even then President Richard Nixon was following the legal developments in 1970. The trial of Manson and 3 of his female co-defendants ran for 8 months. Several subsequent trials were held to prosecute more family members. In the end, Vincent Bugliosi and the prosecutorial team were victorious. They proved to a jury that Manson and the others were guilty of murder, instigated by the motive of Helter Skelter. Manson, according to witnesses, had preached for months about his Helter Skelter race war theory. His followers believed Charlie's prophecy was imminent, and he was the only refuge in the coming storm. Manson also wanted to be a famous singer and pursued a record deal without success. He hobnobbed with famous musicians like Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and Neil Young. But by summer of 1969, Manson had used up the goodwill he had garnered. Frustrated with his inability to access the resources that he depended upon, and with his dreams of fame even bigger than the Beatles unrealized, he snapped. According to the prosecutor, Manson decided that the family should start Helter Skelter themselves. He ordered several followers to commit a series of bloody murders that they could pin on black people, specifically the militant Black Panthers, to incite rage and retaliation in U.S. cities, and to launch Charlie's vision of Armageddon, Helter Skelter, the cataclysm that would soon put him into global power. The challenge with prosecuting Manson was that you had conspiracy to commit murder by someone who orchestrated others and presented an immediate threat to public safety, but who did not actually kill anyone. Charles Manson had never, to our knowledge, killed anyone, but if he had been set free, according to the prosecutor's argument, he would have orchestrated more murders. Bugliosi had to demonstrate how manipulative and deranged Manson was, while proving guilt and free will for those who acted upon his commands. It was a very tall order. In 1971, Manson and family members Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were found guilty of murder in the Tate LaBianca killings and sentenced to death. The previous spring, Bobby Beausoleil and Atkins were found guilty of murdering Gary Hinman. 3 others, Charles Watson, Bruce Davis, Steve Grogan, were tried for their roles in the murders. All were found guilty. All but Grogan were sentenced to death. But in 1972, the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty. All Manson family murderers had their sentence commuted to life in prison. This allowed each family member the chance at parole. It also gave the public several decades to learn more about Manson, the family, and what led to their crimes. Life imprisonment, rather than death, gave us the opportunity to understand the truth that we were not fully told during the trials. Vincent Bugliosi spent 2 years of his life successfully prosecuting the Manson family for their crimes. In 1974, he co-authored a wildly popular book, Helter Skelter, about his experience, catapulting the popularity of the true crime genre in literature. His depiction of the family is engrossing, and in the book, he passionately articulated the Helter Skelter motive. In subsequent years, Bugliosi also gave countless interviews about the case, the trials, and the motive, he understood the public's ongoing fascination with Manson and his followers. In fact, he fanned the flames of that fascination. The prosecutor not only wrote a bestseller based on the crimes, he retired from the law, dedicating his career to writing true crime. His later books were about the JFK assassination and the Iraqi War. But Helter Skelter was his magnum opus. It remains the top-selling true crime book of all time. Bugliosi wanted the public to believe that a hypnotic psychopath turned the children of America into murderous zombies, a demonic Pied Piper in the paradise of Hollywood. Those fears drove consumers to bookstores in droves for the past 50-plus years. During the trials, Bugliosi was prosecuting multiple defendants who committed horrifyingly savage murders. There were also defendants with lesser culpability, plus a vicious mastermind pulling their strings, one who had the most to gain from the crimes, but kept his own hands clean at his followers' expense. The public needed, nay, demanded, that these monsters be put away, all of them. America couldn't continue to exist in the dark fulcrum of 1969, fearing that our own children could be programmed against us. So Bugliosi had to find a way to secure guilty verdicts for every one of the perpetrators, regardless of whether they actually got their hands bloody. To do that, he had to demonstrate that these killers were brutally different than the rest of us, and that their puppet master was as guilty, no, more guilty, than those who actually committed the killings. To give Bugliosi credit, his legal work was brilliant. He successfully tried the defendants, winning deserved convictions for all. His decision to lead with the Helter Skelter motive in court was probably the right call. But my criticism of Bugliosi, who died in 2015, is that he knew there was more to this story. Yet in the many interviews he gave since the verdicts, he stuck solely to his original motive. Perhaps he felt righteous about his judicial win and wanted to protect his reputation. Maybe he wanted to continue to earn a living as a true crime author and paid expert on news programs. But failing to reveal the full story has hindered our ability to understand the cult mentality and psychopathy that led to these shocking and violent crimes, and which put a major American city in the crosshairs. Vincent Bugliosi had a responsibility to prosecute these crimes to the best of his abilities and put the killers behind bars. But I would argue that he also had a duty to educate the public about what really happened. As we know, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. There were many opportunities for the prosecution to tell the full story, to provide a clearer understanding of the real motives, and Bugliosi chose not to do so, perhaps for selfish reasons. We've learned more from the killers than we have from those who secured their justice. Certainly, most of Manson's followers believed a race war was coming. But those kids didn't kill 10 people for that reason. There was always more to the story than we were told. Since this case was solved, there have been many books, movies, and other offerings that present this story in such a distorted way as to be laughable. It's certainly entertaining to imagine some of the elements of Helter Skelter, Charlie and his family of savage cultists in a fictional light, but it does the world a disservice when those errors are interpreted as fact. As I explained, the first thing I learned about the Manson family murders was false. Sharon Tate did not have her baby cut out of her womb, nor are most of the other Manson family rumors true. Nobody drank the blood of the family's victims. There wasn't a kill list of other celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor and Steve McQueen. Manson didn't father dozens of babies. His own father wasn't black. Charlie didn't have telepathic or supernatural powers. And nobody killed anybody because of Helter Skelter. That isn't to say that Helter Skelter wasn't a motivating factor. As an example, when the World Trade Towers were attacked on September 11, 2001, and Americans learned that Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, was responsible, we demanded answers. Why did he hate us? Why would young men agree to die in such a spectacular act of destruction? Why target our commercial and military landmarks? U.S. leaders at the time offered explanations that were simple and digestible. They hate our freedom. They hate capitalism. They want to spread fundamentalist Islam. Some of those elements were true. They were part of the ideological framing, but they were not the whole story. Bin Laden's hostility toward the United States did not emerge overnight. It was shaped by years of geopolitical conflict, including his involvement in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion in the 1980s, the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War, and his belief that Western influence was corrupting Islamic lands. To him and those who followed him, these were not abstract policy disputes. They were humiliations, invasions, existential threats. Over time, those grievances hardened into doctrine. Doctrine became justification. Justification became action. The men who carried out the attacks were not mindless. They believed something. They believed America was an occupying force in sacred territory. They believed the West was waging war on Islam. They believed their sacrifice would restore dignity and power to a wounded world. Those beliefs were cultivated, amplified, and directed by one man and the network around him. This does not make their actions understandable in a moral sense. It does not soften the horror of that day. Many of us remember the shock of those towers coming down, the attack on the Pentagon, and the heroic effort by a small group of passengers on a plane to prevent further atrocities. I will always remember the grief of that day. And I remember, years later, the incredible relief the night it was announced that bin Laden had been killed by U.S. Special Forces. But if we reduce 9/11 to a slogan, if we say simply that they hated our freedom, we miss the machinery underneath. We miss the personal grievances, the ideological indoctrination, the manipulation of fear and humiliation that transformed followers into instruments. One man ordered an attack. Others carried it out. And you cannot understand what happened unless you examine why those others believed him. What is the difference between legal motive and underlying motivation? Each is influential in the commission of a crime, but motive can be proven in a court of law. Usually, to present the most powerful argument, the one jurors are most likely to believe, prosecutors will present the simplest, most persuasive motive. Helter Skelter became the motive against the Manson family because it was part of the motivation, and Bugliosi knew the jury would convict on it. But the myth of Helter Skelter has endured as the reason why the victims of the Manson family were killed, when maybe the true motive, just like 9/11, was one man's revenge. For decades, we believed that the Manson family killed people to start a race war. That motive makes it easy to dismiss the family as crazy or drug-addled, or to chalk it up to the lunacy and chaos of the 1960s. It was a different time. There was a war going on. We were on the verge of a revolution. It's just not that same now. Statements like those are misleading. There are great differences between 1969 and today, but not as many as you might think. By the late 60s, America had been engaged for a decade in an overseas war effort that resulted in the loss of tens of thousands of lives, fighting against an ideology contradictory to Western ideals. We had witnessed the public assassinations of national leaders and civil justice advocates. There was a clear anti-establishment sentiment which bred distrust in government, prompting clashes between civilians and police. Violent riots took place in our cities. Drug use was rampant. Voices demanded equality in housing, in the workplace, and in political representation. Americans were becoming divided between the haves and the have-nots, and all across the nation, false ideals based on religion were being used for power and control. Not to mention, we had leaders at the highest offices of our land who were distrusted, even hated, by many Americans. Think this bears no resemblance to today? The Manson Family, More to the Story, will attempt to provide a clearer understanding of the real motive behind some of the most notorious murders in United States history. Hopefully this will debunk the lies and misconceptions that make us all vulnerable to predators, cults, and charlatans. Thank you for listening to the Manson Family, More to the Story. In this podcast, we focus on peeling back the layers, one chapter at a time, in order to demystify the family and destroy the myths that leave us in the stone-cold dark. In our next episode, Son of Man, we meet Charles Manson before the myth, an unwanted child passed between a negligent mother, a punishing system, and a series of institutions that broke far more than they ever fixed. How does a society that fails a child so completely escape responsibility for the man he becomes? This is H. Allegra Lansing. The Manson Family and the Murders of 1969 have always been more than a crime story. This is a human story, and there is an imperative to understand it, because the vulnerabilities that drew those young people into darkness are not unique to them. They belong to all of us. This podcast series is drawn from my book, The Manson Family, More to the Story, published by Story Stratosphere, and is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. Citations for this episode can be found in the show notes. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is masked by Silent Partner with additional scoring from Echoes of Time by Kevin MacLeod.